She posted it at 11:37 on a Tuesday night. I know the exact time because I was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a manila folder full of documents I'd been reviewing for the third time that week. My phone buzzed. A friend from my old softball league sent me a screenshot with a single message. "Bro, you need to see this." My wife had posted a photo of herself at a rooftop bar downtown, champagne glass raised, her friend Sandra laughing beside her, the city lights blurring soft in the background. The caption read, "Starting over and never looked back. Some people are about to find out what they actually had. Spoiler, he's the one walking away with nothing." 43 likes in 20 minutes. I set my phone face down on the table, took a slow breath, and slid the manila folder back into the drawer. She had no idea I'd been waiting for exactly this moment. My name is Marcus, and by the time my wife, or told me Fadl, call her Renee, filed those divorce papers, I had been quietly preparing for 11 months. Not because I wanted the marriage to end. I want to be honest about that. I spent the first 4 months after I found out trying to save it, counseling, conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning, a weekend away in the mountains that I planned, and she attended with her phone, face down the entire time. But there comes a point when you stop trying to fix what the other person has already decided to burn down. You just make sure you're not standing in it when it goes. Let me back up. Renee and I met when we were both 29. She was working in pharmaceutical sales. I owned a small structural engineering consultancy I'd built from scratch out of a second bedroom in my apartment. 2 employees, modest contracts, more ambition than revenue at that point. We got married 3 years later. I remember her saying at the reception that she loved that I was a builder. She said it like it was the most attractive thing in the world. For the first several years, things were good. Not perfect, but genuinely good. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 4 years apart. My business grew steadily. By the time our daughter started elementary school, I had 14 employees and contracts with 3 municipalities. Renee had moved into a regional director role at her company. We were, by any measure most people would use, doing well. I'm not sure exactly when things shifted. Looking back, I think it was gradual. The kind of drift that doesn't announce itself. She started working later. Weekends away for regional conferences became more frequent. She was more present on her phone and less present in the room. I noticed. The way you notice a slow leak. Not an alarm, just a vague awareness that something somewhere is losing pressure. I found out on a Thursday afternoon in October, almost 2 years ago now. I had come home early because a meeting had been canceled. Her laptop was open on the kitchen counter, and I wasn't snooping. I was genuinely looking for the grocery list she kept in a shared notes app. But the email client was open, and the name at the top of the thread wasn't one I recognized. I read enough to understand everything I needed to understand. His name was Derek. He was a VP at a competing firm she'd met at an industry conference 14 months earlier. The emails weren't ambiguous. I closed the laptop and stood in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't confront her that night. I know that surprises people when I tell them. But something in me went very still and very clear all at once, like the moment before a storm when the air just stops. I thought about my kids asleep upstairs. I thought about everything I had built. And I thought, before I say a single word, I need to understand exactly where I stand. The next morning, after she left for work, I called my older brother, Raymond. Raymond is a CPA who has handled my business taxes for the past 8 years and who has, over the course of his career, seen the financial fallout of more divorces than he cares to count. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't do anything yet. Come to my office this afternoon." I sat across from Raymond for 2 hours. He walked me through everything. What I owned, what we jointly owned, what was commingled, what wasn't. And then he asked me a question that changed the entire shape of what came next. "When did you actually sign the prenup?" I told him. 6 weeks before the wedding. An attorney had drawn it up. Nothing dramatic. Just something my father had insisted on when he found out I was engaged. My father had been through a difficult divorce himself, and he'd said plainly that love is real. But paperwork is also real, and a smart man respects both. Renee had signed it. We had both signed it. I had mostly not thought about it in years. Raymond pulled up the relevant section on his laptop and turned it toward me. The prenup was clear. My consultancy, incorporated 2 years before we married, built with capital I had accumulated entirely before the marriage, was classified as separate property. Any appreciation in value of that business during the marriage was also protected, provided I had not made substantial contributions of marital funds to the business. I hadn't. Raymond had the records going back to day one. It also included a clause, one I vaguely remembered but had genuinely not thought about since the wedding, that in the event of divorce resulting from documented infidelity by either party, the division of jointly acquired marital assets would be adjusted to no less than 60% in favor of the non-offending spouse. I sat with that for a moment. Raymond looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Do you have documentation?" I thought about the emails. "I will," I said. "I want to be careful here about what I did and didn't do in the months that followed. I didn't hire a private investigator in some dramatic movie sense. I didn't follow anyone or make recordings or do anything that felt undignified. What I did was methodical and quiet. I made copies of the emails I had seen. There were more of them over the following weeks, and they weren't hard to find once I knew where to look. I opened a separate personal account at a different bank, not to hide assets, but to begin organizing my own financial picture with clarity. I spoke to a family law attorney named Patricia Holt, who came highly recommended and who I met with 3 separate times over 4 months before I retained her formally. I let Raymond do a thorough accounting of the business and its value, so that if anyone claimed anything about it, we had documentation going back to the original incorporation date. And I tried, in the meantime, to save my marriage. I went to my wife and told her what I knew, not with the documents. Just person to person, honestly. She denied it at first, then admitted to an emotional connection that had gotten complicated. She cried. I cried. We went to 3 sessions of couples counseling before she stopped going. She said the therapist was taking my side. When I asked what that meant, she said I was weaponizing vulnerability in the sessions, which was a phrase I had not previously encountered and which, as best I could tell, meant that I was being too honest about being hurt. She ended things with Derek, or said she did. 3 months later, she didn't. I found out in February of this past year. By that point, something in me had finished grieving. I had done what I believed was right, given the marriage every reasonable chance, been honest, sat in difficult rooms, and said difficult things. When I found out she had gone back to him, what I felt wasn't devastation. It was something quieter, a door closing. I called Patricia Holt the next morning. I want to pause here and say something about my kids, because it matters. My son is 15 and my daughter is 11. Everything I did from that point forward, I did with them as the primary consideration. I was not interested in burning Renee to the ground. I was not interested in public humiliation or making sure she suffered in some elaborate way. I was interested in protecting what I had built so that my children had financial stability, and in making sure that whatever divided our family life looked like going forward, it looked as stable and functional as possible for them. If Renee had been willing to negotiate reasonably and quietly, I would have met her there. She was not. She retained an attorney named Gregory Walsh, who was apparently known in Columbus legal circles for aggressive tactics. Walsh sent a letter within 2 weeks of Renee filing that essentially argued the prenup was unenforceable. Too vague, not properly witnessed, signed under duress. It argued that my consultancy's growth during the marriage represented marital contribution and should be divided accordingly. It argued for the house, for alimony, for a disproportionate share of everything we'd accumulated together. Patricia read the letter, set it down, and said, "He's going to be very disappointed." What Walsh apparently hadn't done, or hadn't done carefully enough, was the actual legal research on Ohio prenuptial enforcement standards. The prenup had been signed more than 30 days before the wedding, well outside any duress window. Both parties had been represented by independent counsel at signing. The business incorporation documents, the bank records, Raymond's accounting, all of it was organized, documented, and clean. And then there was the infidelity clause. Walsh may not have known about it, or he may have known and gambled that we wouldn't use it. Either way, the first time Patricia put it on the table in mediation, the room went very quiet. I should tell you about the mediation session, because it was the first time I had sat across from Renee in a formal setting, and I want to describe it honestly. She came in looking composed. She's always been good at that, presenting calm on the surface. She was dressed well. She had a notepad. Walsh sat beside her with the particular expression of a man who expected to be in charge of the room. Patricia laid out our position methodically. Prenup valid, separately documented, enforceable. Business classified as separate property, with appreciation protected by prior agreement. Marital assets subject to infidelity clause adjustment. Documentation of infidelity available and substantial. Walsh started to object on the prenup, the old arguments. Patricia let him finish. Then she opened a folder and slid 3 printed pages across the table. We have email correspondence documenting the relationship beginning 14 months prior to my client's first communication to his spouse about the matter, she said. We also have records demonstrating the relationship resumed following that communication and continued for an additional 6 months. If counsel would like to revisit the question of the infidelity clause's applicability, we're happy to do that. Otherwise, I'd suggest we proceed on the basis that it applies. Walsh looked at the pages. He looked at Renee. Renee looked at her notepad. He asked for a short recess. In the hallway outside the mediation room, I stood by a window and watched traffic move on the street below. Raymond had driven me there and was waiting in a coffee shop down the block. I thought about the evening I'd stood in my kitchen with that cold cup of coffee and a folder of documents and the soft buzz of a phone delivering news I'd already half known. I thought about the months of quiet work that had followed. All those early mornings in Raymond's office. The careful, unspectacular work of building something solid before anyone else realized the ground was shifting. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Walsh came back, his posture had changed, the way a sail changes when the wind shifts. He said his client was prepared to discuss a revised framework. The final agreement took another 6 weeks of back and forth. But the shape of it was set that afternoon. The prenup held. The business was mine. All of it, including 14 years of growth. The marital house was sold, proceeds divided, but the infidelity clause adjusted that split in my favor. Renee received support for the children. Appropriate. Fair, something I never contested for a single moment. But the alimony claim was withdrawn. She took her car, her personal accounts, her clothing, the furniture she'd chosen for the bedroom. She took what was hers. What she did not take was what she had written on the internet she would. I found out later, through a mutual friend, that the post had gotten more traction than she'd expected. A few people she knew had shared it. Some of them reached out afterward, after the settlement, asking questions she apparently found difficult to answer. I don't take any particular satisfaction in that. I didn't share the outcome publicly. I didn't post anything. I still haven't, except for this. In my own way. In my own time. My kids are doing okay. That's the part I care most about telling you. My son has been quieter than usual, which I understand and don't push. My daughter asked me once, a few weeks after Renee moved into her new apartment, whether our house was still our house. I told her yes. I told her her room was still her room, her books were still on her shelves, and the dog was still sleeping at the foot of her bed every night. She thought about that for a moment and said, "Okay," and she went back to her homework. I still have my business. 16 employees now. 2 new municipal contracts signed this past quarter. Raymond and I have lunch every other Friday, and we talk about the balance sheets. And sometimes we talk about other things. And it's enough. The morning the final papers were signed, I drove home a different way than usual. Along the river, through a part of the city that was just starting to get its fall color, the maples going orange and amber at the edges. I had the windows down despite the cold. I wasn't celebrating, exactly. That's not the right word for what it felt like. It felt like standing on ground that was fully mine again. Solid underfoot. Something I'd built, protected, and held on to when everything around it was trying to become uncertain. My father called that evening. I hadn't told him much about the specifics throughout the whole process, just that things were difficult, that I was handling it, that the kids were okay. I told him it was finished. He was quiet for a moment in the way he gets when he's thinking carefully. Then he said, "That prenup." "Yeah," I said. "I know you probably resented me for pushing that when you were young." I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where my daughter's bicycle was leaning against the fence, and the grass still needed cutting and the ordinary texture of a life I'd kept intact was spread out in the early dark. "No," I said, "I really didn't. People ask me sometimes, not many, just a few who know pieces of the story, whether I'm angry, whether I carry it around with me. I think about that question honestly when it comes up, because I think it deserves an honest answer rather than the tidy version. What I feel, mostly, is clear. The anger was there. Of course it was. It would be dishonest to say otherwise. There were nights in those 11 months when it sat in my chest like something heavy and hot, and I had to breathe through it and not let it make my decisions for me. What I learned, through all of it, was that the anger is loudest when you let it drive. When you go quiet, when you go methodical, when you let the work itself be the response. That's when it loses its grip on you. The best move I ever made was not the prenup, though that mattered. It wasn't the documentation, though that mattered too. It was the decision, that first night in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the phone face down on the table, to be still, to think before I spoke, to build a foundation before I put any weight on it. She had a lawyer who promised her everything. I had 11 months, a brother who knew where every number was, and an attorney who knew exactly where to put 3 pieces of paper on a table. Some things, it turns out, you only need to play once. I've thought a lot about what made the difference in all of this. Not the legal strategy, not the documents, not even the prenup my father pushed me to sign when I was too young and too in love to fully appreciate it. All of those things mattered, but none of them would have meant anything if I had walked into my kitchen that October evening and let the worst version of myself make the first move. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this one. They talk about the twist, the courtroom, the moment the other side goes quiet. What they don't talk about is the 11 months of choosing, over and over again, to be disciplined instead of reactive, to be methodical instead of emotional. That discipline wasn't easy. There were nights when the anger was loud and the patience felt like weakness. But I've come to believe that what looks like patience from the outside is often something harder and more active than people realize. It's not waiting, it's building, carefully, quietly, without an audience. Marcus didn't win because he got lucky. He won because the choices he made long before the crisis arrived, signing that agreement, keeping clean financial records, maintaining his integrity in the counseling room even when it wasn't returned. Those choices created the conditions for a just outcome. That's how cause and consequence actually works in a life. Not dramatically, not instantly, but in the slow accumulation of decisions that either build something solid or quietly hollow out the foundation beneath you. There's a version of this story where Marcus reacts the night he finds out. He confronts, he accuses, he threatens. Maybe he says things that damage his own position. Maybe he makes it emotional in ways that cloud the legal picture. Maybe the anger drives him somewhere he can't come back from easily. I understand that version. I understand the impulse behind it, but that version doesn't end at a settlement table, with a folder of clean documentation and an attorney who knows exactly where to place 3 pieces of paper. The harder and more honest thing I took away from all of this is about character, not as an abstract value, but as something practical. Who you are in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, and the easy thing is the destructive thing, determines what's available to you when the moment of consequence finally arrives. Marcus's father understood that when he insisted on the prenup. Raymond understood it in the way he kept meticulous records year after year. Patricia understood it in the way she prepared before she ever raised her voice. And Marcus understood it standing in his kitchen, alone, choosing stillness over reaction. I think about my daughter asking whether the house was still her house. I think about what it meant to be able to say yes, not because everything was fine, but because the foundation had held. That's what integrity under pressure actually produces. Not a perfect outcome, not a life without loss, but ground that stays solid when everything around it is shifting. What you build with honesty, patience, and clear thinking, nobody can take that from the table.